Sure, sure. So action research and teacher research are two terms that are often used synonymously. And for most people, even those who work in those fields, they do tend to sort of conglomerate together, and for good reason, but they really are, they have some foundational similarities, but also some really critical differences. So I'm going to start with just talking about ways in which they converge, ways in which they share an affinity. And I think despite the fact that they are sometimes used synonymously, they are actually quite opposite in direction and scope. So the thing that's probably most important is that they're both they both rely heavily, not exclusively, but heavily on qualitative traditions in research and depart from quantitative. Um, but what's important to remember is that as qualitative research domains, they're both empirical, which means data-based. For some reason, people forget that empirical means something very simple, which is data-based. And to go a step further in this case, because data could be numerical, but in this case, it's really more in line with the traditional word root of empirical, which means sensory connected. They really do depend on touch, taste, um, thinking, feeling, smelling, experiencing. And so consequently, they tend to be more narrative, anecdotal, and experiential in nature. Um, so that's something that they share. And but the differences soon really emerge once you start to look closely at what they produce and what the experience of working in those traditions is. So I'm going to start with action research because I think it chronologically and historically precedes teacher research by about 10, 15 years or so. So the thing about action research is that the title gives you a kind of clue. It is rooted in action. It seeks explicitly to connect with change, specifically, usually uh, institutional change. It seeks to identify a problem and to explore a solution to that problem that is resolved through action, through taking action, through being proactive. And as such, it tends to be outwardly focused. It's external. You might almost say centrifugal, you know, moving away from the center, moving away from the personal. But that often means that it has political and social dimensions, and it's rooted in conflict, to be honest. Historically, and I can't quite pinpoint this exactly, but I think it's rooted in 1940s World War II era concepts of organizational management. Like, I don't think you can link it specifically to the military, but it somehow happens in that general vicinity. And I think that's where it springs from. Teacher research is sort of the uh, stepchild once removed in a way. Um, Teacher research actually can, which is now more frequently called practitioner inquiry, which is a term I'm growing to like more and more. Teacher research actually does have a very specific ground zero origin point. Back in 1963, British educator and researcher Stenhouse. I forget his first name. I want to say John, but I don't think that's it. Lawrence Stenhouse used the term teacher research for the first time to talk about research conducted, designed and conducted by teachers, by people who live with the interactive dynamic of education as opposed to people who come from the outside. And what's interesting, though, and this may even be the connector piece, is that Stenhouse has some cultural and contextual history behind him. About a decade before, in the 1950s, in England also, Maxwell Jones was a psychiatrist working with patients who had mental illness and strongly developed the group therapy model, the idea that mental health patients and particularly people with addictions, might have the key to their own salvation within their experience in community with others. There's a great book about some of his work called Community as Method. And so what he did was he experimented with patient-managed therapy. And of course, there was a great deal of resistance. People basically said the inmates are running the asylum, which was kind of true, literally. So teacher research, I think, comes out of that, the idea that, you know, and I think it was Paulo Freire who said the person with the problem is the person with the solution. So what's interesting is that teacher research in its functioning is sort of the dynamic opposite of action research. It may connect to outer issues, but it's really personal, it's individual. It may connect to larger contexts, but it's really about an individual teacher or a small group of teachers identifying a challenge that they want to explore, you know, a personal learning curve, something in their own teaching, in their own classroom context that they feel they need to do better in order to teach their students better, because maybe their students don't learn the way they teach. So there's a centripetal focus, a sort of inward focus, and it really does seek to explore and articulate beliefs, attitudes, assumptions, biases, subjectivity, as a way of enhancing your role as a decision maker, a cultural agent. And what's very interesting is that although teacher research doesn't necessarily seek to create the same kind of change that action research does explicitly, when you read good teacher research, the language of change is all through it. Usually it's personal change. It's an awareness. You know, I teach differently now. I see things differently now. I've learned how to listen better. So those are the sort of two differences. So they, as I said, they share a common foundation in looking at qualitative methodology, but they have different trajectories. So that's